Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara.
I'm Sam.
Over the weekend, the remaining 5 members of the Bali Nine were returned to Australia after spending nearly 2 decades in Indonesian jails. Their return to the country wraps up a story that dates back to 2005 and has had far-reaching implications for both Australia and Indonesia.
So we're talking here about a story that's turning 20 next year in its age in the news cycle. A lot of people listening would have been young children when this story broke. You would have been 8, I was 10. Why don't we start then at the very beginning? Take me back to that 2005 moment. Who were the Bali Nine and what did they do?
Yeah, so in April 2005, 9 Australians were arrested while trying to smuggle heroin into Australia from Bali, Indonesia. Between them, the group was carrying around 8 kilograms of heroin in plastic bags.
So quite a sizable amount of the drug.
Yeah, so there were group leaders and then people who were also found with the drug themselves. So the group's leaders were Andrew Chan and Mayuran Sukumaran, and then the other members included Renee Lawrence, Martin Stevens, Scott Rush, Michael Shugai, Sigi Chen, Tanduk Tan Nguyen, and Matthew Norman. Now, what happened was that Indonesian authorities arrested the group in Bali after they actually received a tip-off from the Australian Federal Police.
So they were at the airport in Bali attempting to return back to Australia.
Correct. And the AFP tipped off Indonesian authorities who were then able to move to arrest the group. At the time, Australian newspapers reported that the AFP had told Indonesian police to take, quote, whatever action you deem necessary. Now, I think that quote needs to be understood in the context of Indonesia's drug laws because Indonesia has some of the strictest penalties for drug offences in the world. You know, things including lengthy prison sentences and, of course, the death penalty. So what ended up happening was that 5 of the 9 were arrested at Denpasar Airport in Bali. 4 of whom had heroin strapped to their physical bodies. The remaining 4 were then arrested at a Bali hotel.
There's some really iconic photos of them without their shirts on. You can actually see how the heroin was strapped.
Yeah, exactly. And just before we move on, I do just want to mention, I guess, the timing of this is important because the Bali Nine arrests happened 6 months after authorities detained another Australian at the same airport. That was, of course, Schapelle Corby. And Schapelle Corby was a young woman at the time and she was found with more than 4 kilograms of marijuana inside her boogie board bag. And she was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. And so I think that it's important to just remember, like, this was not the first big story that had emerged relating to drugs and Indonesia in even a matter of months. And so there were these 2 extremely high-profile incidents happening almost simultaneously.
And they continued to happen simultaneously through the next part of this story, which is the trials that both of them went through. Today we're talking about the Bali Nine. So they were arrested after a tip-off from the AFP.
Yeah.
They then got arrested. There's those photos of them with heroin strapped to their body. What happened next?
So, yeah, like you said, they were arrested in April and it was by October that same year that separate trials for the group members had begun. So I mentioned that the 2 leaders were Chan and Sukumaran. So they were found guilty of organising the attempted smuggling and they were sentenced to death. The other 7 were sentenced to life imprisonment. And there is, of course, a very big difference between those 2 sentences. I distinctly remember when Chan and Sukumaran were actually executed. So it was in 2015, which is almost a full decade after they were first arrested and after this story really first took place. They were killed by a firing squad in Indonesia. And I think that we should highlight that both their lawyers and the Australian government at the time tried to intervene to stop that from happening.
As they would with an Australian almost anywhere in the world.
And that goes back to the fact that Australia doesn't have the death penalty. No jurisdiction in Australia has had the death penalty since 1985. In 2010, the federal parliament passed a law prohibiting the death penalty from ever being reintroduced. And so, as you said, the fact that there were these Australian citizens who were ultimately executed by a firing squad was grounds for the Australian government to intervene. They were ultimately unsuccessful and that death penalty held. At the time, then Prime Minister Tony Abbott called their executions cruel and unnecessary.
And another aspect of the Indonesian justice system that I think all of us following that story over that 10-year period encountered was the ability for media to go into prison and do interviews with those two men, but in fact some others in the Bali Nine group.
I remember the artworks.
There was a big kind of art component to particularly Mayur and Sukumaran's time in prison. The trials themselves were filmed, and I think that was a unique experience for Australia. Okay, so they were executed in 2015.
Yeah.
Take me through the remaining members.
Hi, I'm Elliot. I produce the video that you're currently watching. If you're enjoying it, be sure to hit subscribe and check us out on our other platforms. It really helps to support the work that we're doing here at TDA. Now, let's get back to the deep dive.
So another member, Tanduk Tan Nguyen, died of cancer in 2018. And then the final person who wasn't included in the 5 who were returned over the weekend was Renee Lawrence. She was the only female in the group, and she was actually freed in 2018. Her sentence was reduced. It was reportedly due to a number of factors, but the most prominent one was good behavior.
Right.
And so she could apply to have her sentence reduced. She was successful, and so she was freed back in 2018. So that left 5 remaining members of the Bali Nine who, until this past weekend, were still in prison. So nearly 20 years.
Yeah, and if you just think about that, I mean, they were in prison in Indonesia, last week. So right up until today, that was the situation.
Yeah.
They're now home. What led to their release?
Well, last month, both international and Australian media started reporting that there was something happening, that there could be a deal on the horizon that would see these remaining members returned back to Australia.
And just to clarify, they've been pushing for this
for decades.
Right.
Yeah. At the time, so in late November, the Australian government wouldn't really confirm exactly what was going on, except that Trade Minister Don Farrell told Sky News that negotiations were ongoing. That didn't really seem like a huge departure, given that, negotiations had been ongoing for a while. He did say, though, that the proposal wasn't to release these people. That's a direct quote from him. But rather, he was saying that they would be serving their sentence in Australia. At the time, when these were all just reports and rumours, the coalition criticised the government for a lack of transparency surrounding the negotiations. And so that was, for the last couple of weeks. And then on Sunday, sometime in the early afternoon, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese released a statement. And in that statement, he confirmed that the 5 remaining Bali Nine, so those 5 Australians, had landed on Australian soil for the first time in nearly 2 decades. What was interesting is that unlike what the government was saying last month, where they said that, they weren't going to return as free men and all of these things, they actually have returned as free men. So Albanese's statement said they will now have the opportunity to continue their personal rehabilitation and reintegration here in Australia. So they were reportedly released back to Australia on humanitarian grounds. And we'll have to really undergo rehabilitation here at home.
And I think to dive into the reason why this is such a political story with so many government departments involved and why this became such a kind of diplomatic negotiation is, and this was noticeable in Prime Minister Albanese's statement as well yesterday, is that Australia needed to strike the balance between respecting the law of Indonesia and ensuring that it wasn't a green light for people to smuggle drugs between the two countries. Yeah. But also then protect the rights of its citizens. And I think that's why it took so long. But now they're here and they're not going to serve any prison time. Yeah.
In his statement, Albanese said that the 5 had committed serious offences. He was really trying there not to undercut the severity of what had happened.
Yeah.
And he said also that Australia shares Indonesia's concern about the serious problem that illicit drugs represent. But again, as you said, he did highlight that they had served 19 years for the crimes committed.
Okay, so now they're on Australian soil and they're not going back to prison. I expect that we'll hear stories from these 5 men over the next little while. When
I imagine there's a lot of competition for who's going to get that first sit-down interview.
Well, have we heard from the men yet?
So there was a statement from their lawyers and families, and it was mostly just expressing gratitude. It was saying things like they're immensely grateful to the Indonesian government, to the Indonesian president, that they sincerely thank them. It also went on to thank successive Australian foreign ministers and governments who they said had also advocated for the men. So really it was just a lot of gratitude, a lot of thankfulness. I imagine, as you said, we'll have a lot more that we'll hear from them. But ultimately they're now kind of free to move about as they like with very few restrictions on their movement. At least that's what the reporting is suggesting is the case. One thing I have read, though, is that they are banned from entering Indonesia again, but, can't imagine that would have been high on their list anyway.
There was an interesting line at the end of the statement from the Prime Minister that said that he requested the media to give privacy to the men and the families, which is interesting when you think about your comment. That's right, where there will be a bit of a race now to see who can secure an interview, but it's been a long time in an institution, and to be reintegrated to Australia almost overnight.
It was the same as Schapelle Corby, who, we mentioned a bit earlier. I don't know if I made clear that she had since been released as well. But when you serve for such a long time, so many things change in the outside world. So certainly, privacy as was requested, but will be really interesting to see what happens next.
Zara, thank you for taking us through that story, and thank you for joining us wherever you're listening to this podcast on this hot Tuesday morning. That's all we've got for you today, though. We'll be back again in the afternoon with some headlines. If you enjoyed this podcast, it would mean so much to us if you sent it to a friend or gave us a rating. We'll speak to you in the afternoon.